It's time for the whole 9 yards. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ralph Ventre. It is week 8 of the FCS football season, an action-packed week 8 at that. All 9 Northeast Conference teams are in action. 4 NEC games to go over, including our highly anticipated NEC Game of the Week on ESPN3. I'll tackle all the matchups and more on the opening drive. Up first, St. Francis at LIU. The LIU Sharks are clawing and getting closer, looking for their first win in their first FCS season. The Sharks have dropped back-to-back one-score games on the road. Although they've yet to break into the win column, they have, at the very least, impressed SFU head coach Chris Valerial.
Yeah, they're competing at a high level. Big offensive line, big. These guys are big, and they're maulers, and they like to get their hands on you. They like to maul guys. They got a quarterback. It's very smart with the ball. They got some fast running backs. This is, they create some mismatches. They're tough to prepare for, and on their defensive side, they fly around. They created, their linebackers are fast, fluid, downhill, and they did a great job, playing Duquesne up there. So, we have to be on our A game, and it's going to be on the road. It's their homecoming. They're going to be pumped up for this. So we know what's going to be expected.
St. Francis will make its first ever trip to Brookville, and the Flash will have to contend with a tough Sharks defense. In its past 2 games, LIU held the opponent under 200 yards passing. Jerome Brooks III in the secondary, Abel Joseph up front. Sharks have made it tough on opposing offenses of late. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ball, LIU quarterback Clay Beathard has accounted for at least 1 touchdown in 4 consecutive games. We'll talk about Beathard's favorite target later on in the show. As for Saturday, Beathard will lead the Sharks up against an SFU defense that has been one of the best in the FCS, statistically speaking. The Red Flash, number 1 in team pass defense efficiency rating, and number 2 overall in the nation in third down defense. Opponents are converting at fewer than 25% of their third down opportunities against SFU. Now, as far as the pieces to that SFU defense go, Will Dejan Lee, he was doing his thing last week against Robert Morris, 3 tackles for a loss. Nick Ranella, an all-NEC safety, he had an interception in the double overtime setback to RMU. And then there's this Dorian Jackson, 6 big tackles, 6 PBUs in 1 week against Robert Morris. He's caught the eye of Chris Valerial.
He's been playing well. He's been getting better, each week. He's been, you can see his confidence levels going up. He's becoming a leader on the field, so that's great to see. When you see a young man have some opportunities and step in, and you see the maturity, it's great to watch.
Red Flash looking to get that losing taste out of their mouth from last week's defeat. LIU looking to break into the win column. A lot at stake in this NEC affair, live from Brookville, New York on NEC Front Row. Before we continue down the conference slate, we'll take a moment to check in on the Merrimack Warriors. They're in their first season of reclassification into the Division I ranks. They're facing 4 NEC teams at different junctures this season. This week, however, they are on the road at MEAC member Delaware State. The Warriors are attempting to notch that first FCS win. They have 2 wins this season, both at home, both against non-Division I programs. They're looking for that first D1 FCS win. They've been oh so close recently. 2 weeks ago, a one-score loss to Bryant, a game that they led. A week before that, a 10-3 defeat at Lehigh. They certainly put a scare into the Mountain Hawks in that one. Then back in week 2 of the season at Central Connecticut, Merrimack battled back from a 3-score deficit to tie the game late. They fell on a last-second field goal. So the Warriors have been close. They're scrapping, they're clawing, and they're hoping to make Delaware State their first victim on Saturday. Delaware State also looking for its first FCS win of the season, and one opposing player that DSU will have to keep tabs on. That's Merrimack senior receiver Marquis Spence. He's been fun to watch lately. 16 catches, an NEC single-game season high against Lehigh. I mentioned that Central Connecticut game. He had the big game-tying touchdown catch in that one. He's someone that the opposing defense will have to account for, and he's someone you should watch when Merrimack visits Delaware State on ESPN+. Next up, it's a battle of NEC rivals in New England. Central Connecticut, which has 4 road victories, they return home fresh off a top 25 ranking, and they will host the Bryant Bulldogs. Bryant comes in after last week's home win over LIU, but now all the focus turns to CCSU. Bryant head coach Chris Merritt sees a rather impressive opponent awaiting his dogs this week.
Athletically, I think they're probably the best team we've played all year, to be honest with you. I think their experience up front, their offensive line is valuable. They have a transfer quarterback in that's, he's lightning in a bottle. He runs around pretty good. They've got some of the best skill that we've seen all year. Defensively, they are a stout, large front. They rely on pressure, and we have our hands full. So we need to play a flawless football game.
Now, this will be Central Connecticut's first game since the school removed the interim tag from first-year head coach Ryan McCarthy. McCarthy, who has taken over for Pete Rossimondo. If you remember, Rossimondo left to take an assistant job at Rutgers. Well, McCarthy took the reins. Central's off to a 5-1 start under his leadership, their best start in more than a decade. He, of course, is the offensive mind behind what has been one of the top offenses in the FCS this season. Central Connecticut averaging 6.96 yards per play. That's 8th highest in the football championship subdivision. CCSU's transfer quarterback Aaron Winchester has been terrific of late. His best game yet in Week 7 at Columbia. He engineered the offense to the tune of a season-high 511 yards. And as you can imagine, Bryant head coach Chris Merritt is expecting a tough test.
The defense has made such progress throughout the year. First couple of ball games, we gave up quite a few yards rushing. I think Saturday they gave up less than 50, and I think that speaks highly of Coach Masella, his staff, as well as the confidence level that the defense is playing with right now. And that's 2 ball games in a row that they have shut out the potential game-winning drive on the field in the fourth quarter to give us the victory. And their confidence is very high, but it's going to be tested Saturday. We have a good opponent coming up, and we need to fire on all cylinders.
Now, a key matchup will be Bryant's defensive end, Tomas Wright, going up against the CCSU O-line. We'll talk more about Tomas later in the show. As for CCSU on the defensive side of the ball, they've been really effective during this season opening 6-game stretch as well. The CCSU defense has held its last 4 FCS opponents under 300 yards of offense. Linebacker Trey Jones he has at least 1 tackle for a loss in 4 of his last 5 games. CCSU looks to keep the train rolling. Bryant, with other ideas, looking for its 2nd conference win in a row. You can see this one unfold live on NEC Front Row. Robert Morris at Wagner. Both teams 1-0 in conference play. RMU is riding high into Staten Island. The Colonials pulled off a dramatic road win last week at St. Francis, and now this is a team that has put a number of impressive things on film thus far this season, and Wagner head coach Jason Hoteling has taken notice.
It's a much different Robert Morris team than last year or the year before. I think Coach Clark has them playing extremely hard. You know, that's a huge difference as far as just how they're running to the football on defense. They're finishing their blocks on offense. If you look at their schedule, who they've played, they've pretty much been in every game. And then to go into VMI and beat VMI, to go into St. Francis and beat St. Francis. I mean, I would say, you know, talent-wise and from what I've seen on film, they're near the top of the league in all 3 phases.
Robert Morris has a surging sophomore in the offensive backfield, none other than New Jersey's own Elijah Jackson. In the Colonials' 2 victories this year, both road wins, Jackson was well over 100 yards. In fact, in the past 4 games, Jackson has had at least 110 rush yards. In every one of those, he's definitely a weapon that poses a threat to Wagner.
The tailback is dynamic. I mean, Jackson he's number 20. I think steadily they've given him more and more touches. Really dynamic player.
In terms of slowing down Jackson, or attempting to do so at least, Wagner will rely on one of its strengths, and that's the defensive front 7. Chris Williams, Cam Gill, the list goes on and on. It's a deep and impressive unit, and lately it has had great success against the run. In the last 3 games, the Wagner defense has limited opposing ball carriers to just 3.1 yards per rush attempt. If they continue to clamp down on the opposition, they'll be 2-0 in conference play. So it'll be Jackson up against the Wagner defense in one of the many games within the game. Wagner and Bobby Moe both looking to start 2-0 in Northeast Conference play. Watch it live on NEC Front Row. It's the final play on our opening drive. It's a mouth-watering matchup, a grudge match, a highly anticipated one between the 2018 NEC co-champions. The Duquesne Dukes are coming off a bye, and they've gotten the best of Sacred Heart of late in this series. The Dukes have won 4 straight meetings against the SHU Pioneers, including last year's 28-24 triumph in Pittsburgh. It hasn't just been Sacred Heart that Duquesne has had success against. It's been the entire NEC. The Dukes are 20-5 in their last 25 games against Northeast Conference foes. Now, I mentioned last year's 28-24 victory for Duquesne over Sacred Heart, and in that game, the 2 teams combined for 595 rush yards, highlighted by a huge day from Duquesne running back A.J. Hines. Hines with over 200 yards in that one. He missed a little time due to injury this year, but he was back on the field in Duquesne's most recent game. He went for 140 yards against LIU, looking much like his old self. And you better believe that SHU head coach Mark Nofri will have his Pioneers keying in on A.J. Hines.
I think, number one, they have to stop Hines. I think everything goes through him. He's a dynamic player. He's probably one of the better running backs we've ever seen here in the NEC. It starts with him. If we can stop the run, and get him in second and long or third and long situations, that gives us a chance.
Now, as for Sacred Heart on offense, the Pioneers have one of the more potent attacks on the circuit. They are averaging 6.2 yards per play. That's second in the conference. 409 yards per game. That is also second in the NEC, second to only CCSU. One of the reasons for Sacred Heart's offensive success has been sophomore running back Julius Chestnut. He is the 5th leading rusher in the FCS thus far this season, and he did pretty well in limited action in last year's trip to Duquesne. Chestnut, only a rookie at the time, had 10 touches, over 130 yards for the Pioneers. He'll look to get it going again against this Duquesne defense on Saturday, but this Duquesne defense, they are no cakewalk. The Dukes rank 13th overall on the national leaderboard when it comes to total defense, allowing just a little under 320 yards per game. Now, the Dukes defense is big up front, but they are also strong on the back end. Reed Harrison, Duke Croce, Davon Ellison, that is a battle-tested, experienced, and capable secondary. And on Saturday, that secondary will be charged with slowing down SHU freshman Tyrese Chambers. Chambers is the leading receiver in the Northeast Conference, 4 games of more than 100 yards. There are great battles to watch all over the field in this one on Saturday, whether it's Chambers against the Duquesne DBs, Chestnut and the Sacred Heart run game, A.J. Hines up against SHU's defense. This should be all it's been billed to be. An instant classic, and it's the NEC Game of the Week on ESPN3. So join Paul Dottino, Rasheed Marshall, and John Schmelk for Sacred Heart and Duquesne. It's time to check in on the NEC stock market. I'll tell you whose value is all the way up. Now, this is a player who I had the pleasure of watching in person in the Game of the Week on ESPN3, Bryant at LIU. He's LIU senior receiver Jake Bofshever. Now, we'll get into the numbers shortly, but first, let's talk about this situation. LIU had an intriguing prospect at receiver heading into the season, Derek Eugene. Now, he suffered a season-ending injury in the first game of the year at South Dakota State. As it was, the Sharks did not have many experienced weapons, but Bofshever has stepped up, and he has been a rather reliable target for LIU quarterback C.J. Beathard. Bofshever coming off his best performance as a collegian last week at Bryant, 10 catches for 110 yards. He has at least 2 catches in every one of the Sharks' games this year. Also had a standout performance at Wagner, 6 grabs for 89 yards and a highlight reel touchdown in that one. And as for his whole body of work this season, he's already eclipsed the numbers he put up last year. In 11 games last year, 22 catches for 252 yards. Already this season, 23 catches for a team-leading 276 yards. His name is Jake Bofshever, and his stock is all the way up. I'm taking the Twitter timeout. Looking at the tweet sheet, 2 CCSU-related tweets popping off the page. First, this one from CCSU linebacker Michael Mushaw, and This is bigger than a game. Mike participated in the annual Andy Talley Bone Marrow Foundation drive, and Mushaw was a match. He donated bone marrow to a young girl named Eleanor. He will get to meet her for the first time in person at CCSU's game on November 9th. This is bigger than anything Mushaw has accomplished on the field, and he's accomplished quite a lot. Keeping it with CCSU, I mentioned earlier in the opening drive that the athletics department has removed the interim tag off of head coach Ryan McCarthy, and McCarthy appears very grateful for that decision and for the opportunity that lies ahead. He shared his thoughts on his Twitter account, and it's important to remember that McCarthy has had a lot of success in Northeast Conference circles. Not only was he the offensive coordinator for Central Connecticut's 2017 conference championship team, but he also spent 13 seasons at Albany. He was at Albany when the Great Danes were a Northeast Conference member, worked on quarterbacks, the passing game, also had a stint as the OC, and he was a big part of legendary coach Bob Ford's staff that won a number of NEC titles up in the Capital Region. Now, he's officially the head man in charge in New Britain. Congratulations to Ryan McCarthy. That's amazing, bruh. What has me in a state of amazement this week? It's the pass rushing ability and the prowess of Bryant defensive end Tomas Wright. I told you I'd talk about him later in the show. He's coming off a monster performance in the win over LIU. 4.5 tackles for loss. He was a Stats FCS Defensive Player of the Week honorable mention, and his career sack number with 3 last week is up to 27.5. That is 4th most amongst active FCS players. 3rd place is actually Wagner's Cam Gill, but Wright, who is 4th amongst active FCS leaders, he is now just 2 sacks shy of tying Bryant's all-time program record. Here's what his head coach had to say about his recent surge.
Tomas physically has gotten much bigger in the last 12 months. And late in the season, you start to see where that's going to start to really be important. Tomas has been a very solid player for us, and he makes plays, and there's no bones about it. He's our best defensive lineman, and that's what he's here to do.
He's gotten bigger. He's gotten stronger. The sacks are piling up, 27.5 to be exact, and stats amazing. A quick did you know in the DYK this week. We're talking more about Central Connecticut. Did you know that Central Connecticut is in the Stats FCS Top 25 for the first time since the 2006 season? CCSU beat perennial national power Georgia Southern back in that 2006 season. They finished 8-3. Now they're back in the national polls for the first time since, and the Blue Devils are actually the first NEC team in the national top 25 since Duquesne pulled in the number 21 ranking in the final edition of the 2018 poll. As we do every week, we chop it up with Rick Saratella of NFL Draft Bible. I spoke with Rick earlier in the week, and here is our Week 8 edition of the NEC Football Chop Shop. Rick, welcome back. I'm glad you could chop it up with us. We are going into Week 8. getting right into the heart of conference play. Central Connecticut had a good non-conference win last week over Columbia. We'll look ahead to a big matchup pending in the NEC this Saturday. First, let's get your Week 7 game balls, and then we'll go into that highly anticipated Week 8 matchup.
Let's do it, Ralph. Out here on the West Coast, but got my NEC app for the weekend so I can keep tabs on all the conference play. But you mentioned CCSU, Central Connecticut. Welcome to the top 25, my friend, and that's because of Captain Winchester. He has guided this team now to a big record, big win, putting the win in Winchester, but 393 total yards last week against a tough Columbia defense. This is a transfer from Georgia State. He spent the past 4 years at Georgia State, comes in, fills the shoes of Jacob Dolegala. This offense hasn't skipped a beat. So Aaron Winchester, the dual threat quarterback, getting my offensive game ball. The Blue Devils are road warriors right now, and they've set themselves up nicely for the back end of the remaining schedule because now they cracked the FCS top 25. There's only one way to go, and that's up. Another guy moving up, and I must be wrong because he is so right, Thomas Wright of Bryant University. This guy is a playmaker. He's been all over the field for the Bulldogs, and he's had 7 tackles last week against LIU. Big 27-22 victory there. But this is a guy now that the NFLPA Bowl is going to have to start to pay attention to and look at because, he could be a safety prospect. He could be a linebacker prospect. This much I know. He is a fire starter on defense. He now has 8 career forced fumbles. And when you have a guy that's constantly around the ball, constantly creating turnovers, constantly coming up in the clutch, you have to start paying attention. The other thing on Wright, we talked about his versatility, being able to get after the quarterback, sideline to sideline lateral movement, but he also has 18 sacks in his past 18 games. So quarterbacks now have to account for him, where he's lining up before the snap, and he's getting after it this year.
All right, so Winchester and Wright got the game balls for Week 7. Now let's look ahead to Week 8, and there is really, to be quite frank, a mouth-watering matchup awaiting the 2 co-champions from last year, Sacred Heart and Duquesne. They both put up a ton of offense last year in the game, and I know that they both want this one pretty bad, and they need this one in terms of the race for the Northeast Conference crown. So I know that you're locked in on Sacred Heart and Duquesne, which just happens to be the NEC featured game of the week on ESPN3. So make sure you got that ESPN app up and running for this weekend, Rick. What should we expect from this game? What can we expect from these 2 teams?
Well, you said it. This is a crucial matchup early on in the in-conference play here, and Family Day at Sacred Heart, ESPN3, noontime kickoff Eastern time. I'll have my app and keeping tabs on this one. And, quite frankly, Central Connecticut into the top 25 this past week. A win for Duquesne on the road at Sacred Heart. You could see 2 NEC teams crack that top 25 if they come out victorious. But they're going to have to stop that freshman playmaker, Tyrese Chambers. He just does it every week, Ralph. It's like instant replay here on the Chop Shop. Every week we're talking about the fabulous freshman. 4 times now, NEC Rookie of the Week. 3 times over 130 receiving yards. Another $139 this past year, 7 catches, takes the slant route 75 yards to the house, outruns the entire defense there. And they were serving up Quaker toast at the University of Penn last week as Chambers just burnt the secondary all day long. And then we talked about this 3-headed trio. Again, Julius Chestnut now up to 689 rushing yards through his first 6 games, a $147 on the ground last week, 33 receiving out of the backfield. He's a problem. And this Logan March, he got out to a lightning start quick. It's been kind of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personality here. from the start of the season to his last few games. He had 278 receiving yards last week, passing yards, 2 touchdowns, but also 2 interceptions. He's got to keep the turnovers down, Ralph. Only completing 56% of his passes. Marchie's got to get better than that. So we're going to keep an eye on that. Special teams, Sacred Heart, digging in the crates here. Kezio Snelling, keep an eye on this young man. 24.5 yards per kick return. He's got over 400 kick return yardage on the season. If Sacred Heart wants to pull this one out, special teams is where they're going to have to win this game. Snelling is a guy to keep an eye on. And, of course, on the other side of the ball, Ralph, Duquesne, we've talked so much about their firepower, especially on offense. A.J. Hines and Mark Allen with that 1-2 combination. They each got about 300 yards rushing on the season. We've talked about Kellen Taylor, the basketball convert, 6'5" playmaking receiver. But it's the defense that I want to talk about. And we've talked about Cam Clark, last chance you. We've talked about Reed Harrison Ducros. But it's this Davion Ellison who's really stepped up. The transfer from Syracuse, this name might be familiar with you. He had 2 interceptions a couple weeks back against LIU, a fumble recovery. If the name sounds familiar, it was his first interception since 2016 when he was picking off Lamar Jackson in that Syracuse-Louisville matchup a couple years ago. But this Davion Ellison now jumping off the radar. NEC Defensive Player of the Week 2 weeks ago. He's kind of been a jump starter on the defensive side for this Dukes defense.
Yeah, the Dukes, they have a lot of transfers on that defensive side of the ball, and they all seem to be contributing, and they fit in nicely in at their new home on Rooney Field. Of course, they'll be on the road this week at Sacred Heart, but, you mentioned Cam Carter and Reed Harrison Ducros and Ellison, all 3 FBS transfers have fit in nicely into Dave Ofar's defense at Duquesne. So Sacred Heart hosting Duquesne this weekend. I know you'll be watching, Rick, but as always, I appreciate your time. It's a pleasure to chop it up. He's Rick Saratella. I'm Ralph Ventre. Thank you for joining us, the Week 8 edition of the NEC Football Chop Shop. So that will do it. We covered an awful lot today, and I appreciate you sticking with us as we prepare for Week 8 of the FCS season. I'm Ralph Ventre. We'll do it all again next week. Until then, thank you for watching the whole 9 yards on NEC Front Row.